Welcome back, everybody. I'm Goldie Blumenstick. I'm a senior writer at the Chronicle of Higher Education. And since I know some people have been tweeting today, Twitter handle is @GoldieStandard. We're going to conclude the sessions today focusing a little bit more on community colleges. I've actually been noticing, I think that there's a little bit of a Washington, D.C. lens on this discussion today, which I'm finding a little bit interesting. Everyone keeps talking about how we have this highfalutin notion of college. Let's remember that only 30% of this country has a bachelor's degree right now, and so I think we need to broaden our horizons a little bit about what we're talking about today. Also, I was pleased to hear Congressman Cellini talk a little bit about the narrative changing around manufacturing. I think I would argue that the narrative is changing already about community colleges. The questions that this panel is going to take up today is, are they really living up to that new reputation, not just in areas of marketing and getting the word out, but in actually delivering these kinds of good programs that we need to be talking about today. So I'm going to start with, you all have the introductions of our panel, so I don't need to do that for you. I'm going to start with Tom Bailey at my far right here. Obviously a scholar of community colleges. Tom, do you have a Twitter handle?
CCR Bailey, it's either Bailey CCRC or CCRC Bailey.
That's CCRC for Community College Research Center, so dig around for that. So can you just, we've heard a little bit about some of the kinds of things community colleges are doing. Can you just step back and briefly kind of give us an overview about the kind of training that community colleges are doing, and just to give people, make sure they have a full spectrum of things rather than just sort of a haphazard?
Well, okay, so I think that one thing about community colleges is difficult to generalize. There are fabulous programs at some. Some community colleges have wonderful relationships with employers. We've heard some of those. Some of them don't. I think that's and it's very much a local issue. States involved somewhat, but I think it's where it works well is when the local presidents and leadership of the college is working with the local employers community, and that's great. But I want to say that the fact that we've heard some good stories and there's so much variation, I think, is a fundamental issue. Actually, Celeste and I were at a conference she mentioned, the National Academy of Sciences, on middle skills jobs, and I heard so many great things. I sort of left the conference saying, what's the problem? I mean, there's this program and that program, and we've heard that too. And that's true. I guess you could fill up a 2 or 3 day conference with fabulous programs, and we do that. But these aren't randomly selected people from the country who are coming to talk about that. And I think that a community college can absorb many of these individual programs without fundamentally changing. And still, a majority of community college students go, they don't finish, they leave without degrees, many of them are stuck in remediation. So all of these problems continue to exist despite the fact that any of those institutions will have some great programs that we can talk about. And I think that's what I'm trying to summarize a book we just wrote in 2 minutes, Redesigning America's Community Colleges. And I think that, the point we said is the fundamental design of the colleges is what we call the cafeteria model. There's a ton of stuff there, almost everything, some great things, whatever you want, you can get there, except you really have to find it yourself as a student. So the kinds of things that we wanted to argue is that first our programs have to be more structured, better designed, easier to understand, and in this case, I think this is relevant specifically, they need to be connected to wherever you're going, either subsequent education or to the labor market. And in that case, if there really are jobs of this type in your local labor market, those need to be tied to those programs. Now, I say if because I think in some cases there aren't, and I think we need to question. I think there's been some skepticism about the nature of the shortage of skills. So I think that's one thing. Now, the second point, somebody mentioned counseling, and in the typical counseling situation in the community college is a few minutes with a counselor when you come to register. Now, there's some other examples, or there's some exceptions to that, but that's not going to be able to work with a student to tell them about these wonderful opportunities or to allow them to really understand what it is that they want to do and whether that will connect to the opportunities that they have. So I think it's much more than thinking about specific counseling or whether we need some more counseling. Yes, we do, but we need a whole different way of thinking about the intake process of a community college. It's not 10 minutes with a counselor off to the testing center where you're told you're not ready for college and you need to go to remediation. Maybe that's a little bit stark, but that's fundamentally the intake process that we have at community colleges, at most community colleges. Now, there are definitely exceptions. We've heard exceptions this morning, I think. So if we want to be able to connect these programs to employers, whether they're apprenticeships, whether they're good work-based training, whether there's a good program at the college that will prepare people, so we need to develop better programs, better pathways into those programs, and we have to take much more seriously working with students to figure out what it is they want to do and how they can connect to those programs. So I think if we can do that, that will both, I think in general, address the overall problems that we have with completion in community colleges, but it will also allow us to, if there are issues with employment and manufacturing and there are opportunities there, a much more effective way to connect to those opportunities.
So John Colburn from Skills for the Future at Aspen. Do you have a Twitter handle?
John Colborn, yes.
Great, very creative one. So Tom's gotten us started on this topic a little bit here. You've mentioned to me when we were getting ready for this talk that to really be successful with this, the employers and the companies have to be really engaged with the colleges in a much more, not just at the presidential level, not just even at the dean level, but really down to the faculty level a bit. Yep. I think you mentioned faculty development, career advising, guest instruction, job shadowing, capstone projects, job fairs, interview days, all that stuff. Are the colleges even equipped to begin to do some of that stuff?
So, just to build on Tom's comments, in my last job, I was at the Ford Foundation and worked a lot with community colleges, and I had a joke. I would say that community colleges are expert at best practice. They can adopt it and then wall it away from the rest of the institution so it doesn't infect the rest of the college.
So they can do it in isolation.
Exactly. And so I think our challenge is exactly what Tom said. It is the whole school. How do you get these practices throughout the whole school? And I think there are probably three things that really drive that. One is we have the outcomes that we have in community colleges because public policy has been perfectly aligned to get those outcomes. So you want to have a community college where people start a lot of classes but then don't finish those classes, or start a lot of programs but don't finish those programs. Well, then let's be sure we pay people on enrollment, or pay the college on enrollment rather than on result, right? And so I think one thing that certainly we need to be looking at is how do you structure public policy in ways that gets to the kinds of results we want to see. Some of that is payment on performance, but some of that is also on the very governance of community colleges. If you have a community college governance system that is very inward looking, that doesn't really take in perspectives from the community and from employers, then you're likely to get a certain result.
Is there a way to structure a governance policy around that, changing the culture about which way whether it's inward-looking or outward-looking?
So we're actually engaged in developing a reconnaissance across the states because the beautiful thing about community colleges is because they come in so many different shapes and sizes and are subject to 50 different state policies around governance. We actually want to look at what kinds of policies states can adopt that seem to sort of promote better engagement with communities, whether that's around how trustees are appointed or elected, whether that's around how outcomes are rewarded, whether that's around how funding is structured. So I think policy is certainly number one. The second thing, my colleague Josh Weiner at the College Excellence Program at the Aspen Institute would certainly say is leadership. And so when you have a president who and a senior management team that really values outcomes for students and student success, that really focuses on community and employer engagement, you get certain results in the institution. Now, it's uneven to get the right leadership in every single community college, but we know that that has a significant impact. And I think the third thing then is that we need to start treating the processes around employer and community engagement as critical functions, every bit as critical as the bursar function, as the enrollment function, as facilities management. We need to really start having practices and professional development approaches that value that and that provide a sort of management structure, feedback loops within the institution to value that activity. And just another project we're engaged in right now is actually creating a benchmarking tool that can help community colleges and community college programs assess the level of employer engagement that they have. We actually think that measuring something is sort of the first step towards actually valuing it and making it a more systematic function.
Great. Adela Solis, Twitter handle, first of all?
Like John, it's uncreative. It's at Adela Solis.
There you go. You've been studying these programs a little bit, and I know you have some concerns about kind of the nature of the credentials or maybe the nature of the education that comes out of it. We've heard a little bit of this discussion earlier about whether it's a little bit too narrow. Some of these technical certificates, some of the AAS degree. How do colleges guard against keeping these degrees from becoming, or certificates or whatever it is that they're offering as part of these programs, how do they guard against keeping them too narrow?
Right. I'm not sure there's a clear solution to guard against it yet. I think it's sort of, I'm sure that we could all as a group argue about whether this is even true. My concerns are sort of almost more research questions than concerns. I think one solution that I've seen, though, to potentially sort of giving people these narrow certificates that don't provide a foundation for future education or to deal with changing labor markets is the stackable credit idea.
So we all heard about this idea, stackable credits, a certificate that doesn't lead to nowhere, but it leads to something else. And I guess I think it's a very important part of the process, but I'd like to also hear from our panel about whether they think it's actually, are most credentials stackable now? Do they do that?
I would say most are not. I think there's an aspiration to certainly build higher levels of stackability. Look, once upon a time, and I think there was this view that college education was sort of a single dose experience, right? So at 18, you got your dose of education, 4 years, and then you were sort of done. That was never exactly truly true, but I think that was sort of the perception. And I think we're now in the fastest growing area of higher education is the certificate, right? It's this shorter term credential. And I think that reflects a much more rapidly evolving set of skill needs and skill expectations. I think Americans have gotten the message that they need to be continually upgrading their own skills, sometimes with the help of their employer, which is great when that happens. And so I think that then demands that education providers have a mechanism of helping people map to that, so it's not just an ad hoc, sort of episodic, go to the cafeteria, pick up the right, hopefully you're getting the right program. But I think practice certainly lags on that.
The jury is somewhat still out on that. I mean, we already heard some examples about certificates where actually people are coming back with bachelor's degrees or master's degrees.
But that's not a stackable credential. That's a credential that you're coming back to get.
But what I'm saying is if you're looking at, so let's say, a certificate, you want to think of a certificate as we think of an associate's degree kind of as something that leads to a bachelor's degree. Do certificates lead to substantive degrees? In most cases, they don't, just empirically in terms of how many people get certificates and move on. And all I wanted to say about that was that in many cases, the people getting certificates already have bachelor's degrees, so there's a lot of people getting these, quote, lower-level degrees when they actually have the degrees. So I do think that the notion of stackable credential, which, by the way, one of the problems of getting older is that you hear the same discussion for a long time. I've been hearing this discussion for a long time, and I do think it's, at this point, much more aspirational than it is kind of a fundamental part of the education
Which
system.
may be depressing if you've been hearing this discussion for a long time and it's still kind of aspirational.
I don't know. You can take that up with my therapist.
Adela, you want to go back to some of your concerns about these credentials. I know you've also had some concerns about the Associates of Applied Sciences credential.
Right. Actually, sort of related to the stackable credits and talking about certificates idea, I would like my fellow panelists' opinions on how well these credentials are understood across labor markets. We know that people are mobile. So is this effectively training a person who is attending their local community college but then moving to the next city to try to get this job in welding or what have you?
Right, especially when these things are so employer tied.
So I think we all have to acknowledge the credentialing system is completely broken, and there is
Twitter that, tweet that, folks.
Huge confusion among employers, among educators, and among students around just how all these things fit together. Right? We're at a stage right now where basically any Yahoo can put out a shingle and say, I have a credential, and maybe it's got labor market value, maybe it doesn't, maybe it's stackable, maybe it's not. And so there are many efforts now underway to try to impose some level of order or rationality onto that system. I think some of us know about the work at ANSI, the work cred system. Certainly the Lumina Foundation has put significant markers down to try to figure out how you rationalize this system. But it is a huge problem. And one way I think you get around that is certainly something that we at Skills for America's Future are very big on, which is deep engagement of employers in the design, development, and rollout of those credentials. I think one thing that that I like about apprenticeships is that they have been validated, at least by one employer, and with some recognition either from the federal government or from a state government, that in fact there's value to this apprenticeship, to this program.
Does that deep engagement also have to be sort of across an industry standard, not just a local company standard? I'm sort of thinking that might be a way to make some of these credentials a little more useful. That it's not just what this local company wants, but this is a standard that would also be something that will be more transferable.
Yeah, I think the issue of how employer organizations can work together is a major problem, really. And I think if we want to think about making apprenticeship much more broadly available and a kind of a more fundamental part of our education system, then we'll need to get employers to working together more than they are now. So, I mean, I think that the issue about portability, I mean, one of the great strengths of the community college is its local relationships. There's no question about that. Those are great. They can be great. How then you connect that? I mean, I think as you go up the ladder of a bachelor's degree is more mobile, associate's degree are certificates, since we don't really know what they are. And there's a huge amount of non-credit training, which is pretty much completely not portable. The growth of certifications, the whole competency-based education. I mean, we don't even know the effects of certifications because we don't have we talked about data before. We don't have good data on that. Yeah. So yes, there's a lot of things going on there, and we're going to need to be able to understand that more because there's a lot of discussion about that. I think we're still in an institution-based education world, and I think that we can do a lot to improve those institutions and to make them function better. I think the thing about community colleges we have to remember, community colleges were set up to open education to wide groups of people at a low cost. They've been spectacularly successful at doing that. But the problem with designing a college that does that is it's not the same thing as designing one that is going to get students to the end and get students to the goals that they have. And if you have an open system where everybody can get what they want and easily enroll on any kind of a schedule at anything that they want to do, that's going to be difficult, and we simply don't have the advising capabilities to be able to manage people in this kind of chaotic situation.
It's so easy to get off track in
Yes.
that environment. You talked a lot about how these really need a deep employer engagement with the faculty. And to return to the point of the gentleman who raised it earlier, how can you really have that kind of deep employer engagement with faculty when we have such a high adjunctification level of colleges right now? I mean, if the faculty aren't there they're only paid per course.
I mean, somebody said this before. We have to, before I answer that question, have to emphasize, we pay these institutions the least, and they have the students with the most problems. So, as the president said, that's the constraint that community colleges have. We see states completely getting out of the community college funding business in some cases. Right. And the fact is, it is.
But in other states, paying for it for free.
But that's true. But I mean, we can argue that if you actually invest in more full-time faculty or more advisors, you can get your completion rates up, and so the cost completion might come down. Yeah. That's an important thing to remember. But of course, the colleges aren't paying for themselves on the cost per completion. They're paying on the cost per enrollment. And the things that we have to get those costs down tend to be the things which make it more difficult for us to have students to get to the ends that they want. And frankly, will make it more difficult to connect to manufacturers so that we can provide that kind of skill. So let's just, take that as a given. We pay the least to the colleges that have the students with the most barriers. Now, I do think there are things that can be done with adjuncts. I do think there are things we can do under the current funding structure that we have. Certainly efforts need to be made to incorporate those adjuncts in. And as somebody said before, many of those adjuncts are actually practitioners of whatever it is they're teaching. So let's remember that it's not just a bleak plane of part-time teachers. There are certainly, you want some adjuncts there because they're actually current practitioners. But I do think it's a fundamental thing. If we really want to improve the performance of institutions, we're going to have to incorporate as much as we can the part-time faculty that we have.
I actually worked as an adjunct in one of these workforce development programs. So a way that we sort of overcame this high turnover rate, first of all, I should say, I was a very lucky adjunct. We were unionized, so we were paid a good wage and we had benefits. So maybe the first part of the solution is to sort of at least partly get rid of the whole adjunct system.
The exploitation of adjuncts, right?
Mm-hmm. But we, as a faculty developing this program at the very beginning, we're, in a way that sort of the for-profits do actually as well, creating curricula that we hoped would be able to pass down, So even if I left that year, I had this core curriculum that I could give to somebody that was just starting this job, and hopefully they would be able to teach the course the same way that I taught it. Mm-hmm. There are lots of things about that are not ideal, but it is a partial solution.
Yeah, I would think just even having the continuity with your corporate partners or those are harder relationships to maintain.
Right. Those were higher up. I wasn't the one that was getting to talk to the industries that we were creating courses for.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk a little bit about measuring quality of outcomes. Not outcomes of the programs, and I think also making sure that colleges are investing their programs in fields where there's a good payoff for the wages. I know the state of Kentucky has done some work in this area where they've, in the technical college system, where they've eliminated some programs that weren't in high-paying fields. But is there a state-of-the-art best practices about this right now that for what colleges are doing to make sure that they're evaluating their programs well, and particularly looking for the programs with the right outcomes?
Well, I think once again, at least for community colleges, it gets back to the local context, and in some areas, in some high population density areas, then there are lots of different employers, and so colleges can have a variety of programs that speak to that. That there has to be, if they do have relationships to employers and are interacting with them, then they'll have a better idea of what the programs are that are necessary, whether their graduates are actually have the skills that are necessary. So I think that's a crucial element of that. Now, so community colleges have redesigned their programs in some cases. You talk about Chicago. That's an example of Chicago. They have a set of community colleges, the city colleges of Chicago, and they've specialized their programs in different areas in the city because there are different employers and concentrations of employers in those areas. So they've done that. They have or reorganized their programs into broad areas, about 10 of them, let's say health or business. And those are designed in relationship to employers. So I think that's a crucial part of what they're doing.
Is there kind of a right way, wrong way to do that, or you're saying it's really locally? Is there a sort of template for just even these are three good approaches to take? I'm just wondering, how if they say, okay, well, we want to do a better job of measuring. How do they start?
Of course, measuring is different from doing, right? I think it depends on the nature of the business organizations that are in your local area. In some cases, there are, if there's a German Chamber of Commerce or a Swiss Chamber of Commerce there, then you can work with them. If the employers are organized, that's a better situation. If not, then you're in the college, you're going to have to be doing some of that yourselves. to bring that together.
You know, I mean, I think at our College Excellence Program, the Aspen Prize for Community Colleges really values two key outcomes. One is, you know, the success of the student. Are they actually completing a program? And then what are the labor market outcomes for that student upon graduation or completion? You know, you don't want to be completely reductive about that, and there certainly are other purposes that people go to community college, so I don't mean to say that that's the end-all and be-all of every measurement for every program at a community college. But I think you start there, and certainly, you know, we know that there are pending regulation and regulatory proposals at the Department of Education that would start to roll that out, and I think you start there, and you can sort of start working around that. But to me, those are good places to start.
I think there's something else which haven't talked very much about, which is the associate's degree, certificate associate's, or bachelor's degree. So now there are many programs that occupationally specific programs that in community colleges that were associate's degrees working with manufacturers, and now many of those jobs want bachelor's degrees. So I think it's important that maybe this gets back to the stackable issue, but it's important that we think about the future, that we hold open the options that students have so that they can go on and get their bachelor's degree in many of these areas. And I think that I mean, when you really think about what would work is, or what needs to work, and it's very difficult, is that you get the 2-year, the 4-year college and the employers together so that they can work on that. There you have an opportunity perhaps to make a stackable credential. I mean, nursing is kind of an unusual situation. I mean, many associate degree nurses go out and work, and then they go back and get a bachelor's degree. So it's, you know, it's an unusual area, and it's highly regulated because of the certification required of the state. But if you want an example of how it is you want to build that, I think more things are going to be looking like nursing, perhaps not with the state regulation, but I think that's one model that we want to be able to do so that people can get their associate's degree, recognizing that many of those jobs really need more education.
And can I say one more thing, which is just, I think our research understanding of the sub-associate's degree certifications is really limited. And I know the Department of Education is actually building up some new capacities now to be able to understand that better as a country, sort of where we are. But we really, you know, we have very little understanding of which of these certifications really seem to propel opportunity and which ones don't. If you look at the aggregate data, it kind of looks a little murky, bleak.
The aggregate data, I think, shows that there are advantages, but then you have to go dig in and say, this certificate is good.
It has real advantages,
right.
And this one maybe is negative
right.
or has very little advantage.
Some could be very costly and get
Yeah,
nowhere.
I mean, well, we have actually Department of Education funded center, CAPSE, Center for the Analysis of Post-Secondary Education and Employment, and we are doing quite a bit on certifications. Short-term certifications, not surprisingly, aren't as valuable. In some cases, we can't see statistically significant effects. If you want to generalize, certainly health, if you look at the health certificates, they're all, you know, maybe much of the positive effect of certificates comes from health.
Since we're here about manufacturing, do we have any sense of what they are in manufacturing?
I think in manufacturing, it's kind of difficult to do this, but I mean, generally what we find is that certificates will give you a bump in your earnings, but it won't change the rate at which the earnings grow. Whereas associate's degrees tend to not only give you a sort of a bump, but also change the rate at which they grow. So I think that's, they're so varied, they're so different. It's, you know, you're really looking, you know, generalizing about certificates with a bit of anxiety.
So we talked a little bit about apprenticeships earlier today. I know there's been this new $100 million initiative from the Department of Labor. I'm not that familiar with it myself, but I'm wondering if anyone on the panel can say, were there aspects to that grant program that made it more attractive or less attractive to community colleges to be part of it? Is it something that's going to really give a boon to it? I kind of was surprised when I was doing my book how for all the noise about apprenticeships, how few apprenticeships we actually have in this country. That was a little bit of a shock to me.
Absolutely. I mean, I think if you look at the level of investment that the country has made in apprenticeships, we have about the number of apprenticeships you'd expect, right. Given that level of investment. So,
but to this thing in particular, will it really jumpstart anything at community colleges?
Well,
I mean, I think that I've emphasized the institutionalization concept here, and I think if we want to think about this as a broad thing, we want to think about what is the institutional structure that supports apprenticeship. We can have a number of apprentices from dedicated employers, especially employers who have experience of this. I mean, I don't think it's surprising that German and Swiss employers are the ones who are doing this. But I mean, if you think about the institutional structure that supports apprenticeship in Europe, you have very strong employer organizations that actually have authority and that people that work together. You have the unions, you have the social partners, and you have government involvement as well. So it's a triple partnership. And it seems to me that as far as in all of those cases, we're moving institutionally in the opposite direction. So we're going to have apprenticeships, but that's going to be based on dedicated employers who get together on their own without a strong institutional support. Colleges are perfectly happy to provide the classroom-based instruction for those, and I'm sure that many of them actually do that. So they're there available to do that. But I think that what are the wages that apprentices are getting? How is that regulated? What is the quality of the instruction that takes place? Are we going to have some kind of quality assurance procedure that does that? I mean, we've heard from employers today, and I'm absolutely sure that the quality of their apprentices is great. But if we want this to be a mass organization or a mass movement, then I think we need to think about that. So I'm sure we're going to get a growth of it. We have a lot of discussion about it. There's some resources that are put behind it. But I think we have a lot of other type of work to do if we want this to be something more than an interesting thing of which there are some excellent examples, but it isn't really going to grow. So that's my view of it.
I'll leave it with what Tom said.
One of the things that we haven't talked that much about is sort of the preparation level for community college students when they come in, and even when you're going into an apprenticeship program or it's sort of maybe not a formal apprenticeship program, an industry-sponsored program. I think, John, you mentioned to me earlier that math skills, English skills can still be
Huge
quite
barriers.
a barrier.
Yeah.
You've talked a little bit, can you talk a little bit about the nature of the kind of remediation that colleges need to be thinking about? And again, are they in a position to provide that kind of remediation?
So, of course, Tom has studied this, so I'm going to defer to him on the stats. But I think certainly what we are seeing, those programs that seem to be most effective in both working with employers and then working with the student population base as it arrives at a community college are those that seem to be able to embed remedial education of math and English into the instructional program, that do that rapidly and quickly, and that do that in a context that makes sure that the remedial instruction actually relates to the field of study that the student is performing and is interested in. And if you do those things, we seem to see much higher levels of success. If somebody who goes into a traditional, isolated remedial program, particularly if they're one or two or three levels back, the odds of them actually ending up in college-level instruction are virtually zero.
No, I agree with that. I think that the prerequisite isolated remediation that you're supposed to take before you start college, I think that's what's not working. And that there's a variety of ways in which you can incorporate that instruction into college level. If it's a regular math or English, you can use a co-requisite kind of model where students are in the college level program but have some additional instruction or support besides that. I think that the occupational area, as John said, is one where there's tremendous opportunity for that, where you can really embed that instruction contextually into the types of things that you're doing. So you're not off doing a math course over there, the same math course you took in high school that you didn't do well in. You're actually engaged in doing activities on the job and then getting instruction in mathematics where that's relevant to what you're doing. So I think the manufacturing and other occupational instruction. I mean, that's many technical colleges here in the United States actually do that, where they have kind of just-in-time instruction for students who have weak academic skills. And I'm much more optimistic about that. So, and I think in this particular topic of this meeting, I think is an area where there's a lot of potential for that.
So in this case, it actually could be the just-in-time kind of training could actually jumpstart and improve traditional remedial education as well at colleges?
Well, I think also having these basic skills courses embedded in these workforce training programs and certificates, I mean, that helps them move more towards being this foundation for future education.
Totally.
So I think it's really a win-win situation.
I have a lot more questions, but I know we want to get some time to get some folks in the audience. So I don't know if the microphone people are out there yet. There's microphone people and there's some questions. We've got both microphone people and questions. We have a couple right up here in the front. Woman in the red, I think. Go ahead. We'll take a few.
Hello, it's Ariane Higovish from the Institute for Women's Policy Research. I have a question about measurement and about training. The big issue on manufacturing and middle-skilled jobs is that there's such enormous gender segregation. You know, it's like in most of those jobs, there's less than 5% women, the growing jobs. And we know from Perkins, where colleges and K-12 have to measure how many women and men enroll in non-traditional occupations, that there is a huge variation between states of how much they get young women and men to do manufacturing, CTE in school, and then there's a big drop off, and then how much they do in college. So we were talking about marketing earlier. Firstly, can we integrate this issue of access for women more strongly into marketing? But the second thing is then we also heard training hasn't changed, teaching hasn't changed, the workplace hasn't changed, and they think, why should we be here? We're not welcome. So I just kind of, on measurement, on training, on teaching, how can we open good manufacturing jobs to women?
We're all looking at each other.
Yeah.
I guess I know we've been talking about this a long time, and I'm not sure there's a good answer to that. But I do think that, at least from the point of view of community colleges, if we have a more thought out and coherent process for helping students think about what they want to do. Now, I suppose it's perfectly possible that bias can go into that, and perhaps that might reinforce gender segregation. But I think that if men think that nursing is something they don't want to do, and women think that being a machinist isn't for them, I think that we can certainly try to incorporate in the kind of entry work that we do with students to try to fight against those types of biases or stereotypes. I think that would probably require a considered strategy to address that, to talk with people who are engaged in that about trying to make sure that that they're not pushing that particular bias. But
do you see that as the college's role, actually?
Well, I was just going to say, I think employer leadership is key on this, and we know, a few well-placed articles in the New York Times, and suddenly Silicon Valley is very interested in diversity. Right. And I think that's a pull strategy that helps. That suddenly there's now resources and messaging from those employers saying, we care about having a racially and gender diverse workforce, and we're going to work with our education partners to be sure we get that delivered to us. So I think there is something about employer leadership on some of this. I would be remiss if I didn't say that, in fact, in aggregate, leaving aside the non-traditional occupations, in aggregate, we have our problem in higher education is actually getting men into colleges.
It's like 60-40 now.
And getting success for men in colleges and community college. So that
just if you have a system, an unorganized system, where people kind of come into college without much, sort of social support behind them and stumble around into a bunch of courses that we want to expose them to, there's no lever that we have to deal with that. if we have a more strategic approach to helping students figure out what they want to do and helping them do more coherent exploration of their opportunities, then at least there's a lever that we can, that we can pull to try to deal with that. Other than that, we don't have any, other than a billboard or something like that, which I think is a great idea, but I don't think we can count on that to really do that.
I think there's one in the-
Monica Herr, Committee for Economic Development. So this is another measurement data question. The state's got money for longitudinal P20 data systems, which we're supposed to be, the P being pre-K up through 20s. So at least theoretically, if a student was in community college and then stayed in the same state to work, then states should be able to track that through like the UI data and so on. So do we not have that, not even in 1 or 2 or 3 states, so we can start learning about the connections between certificates, training, and employment outcomes, at least initially?
Virginia's doing quite a lot of that, isn't it?
Texas.
Texas has been doing quite a bit.
I guess you probably have some experience with that.
So I'm actually part of Tom's CAPC group. So I've been working with the Ohio data for a long time. And so it is linked, some of it between the institutional P20 data, or we actually just have higher ed is linked to UI. So
Unemployment insurance, just in case.
right. So we really need that to be linked back to K-12. But also there are sort of constant issues related to just kind of the politics of who has access to data. I thought the first panel was really interesting in that it sort of made it sound like we're collecting all of this data, and really the problem is that there aren't enough researchers. We don't have the research capacity to analyze it. But if that's true, there's clearly some sort of relationship breakdown in the pipeline, because there are lots of people that want to answer these questions, including myself, with state data sets, with national data sets, and definitely with data that has to be linked to the UI data. The state data has to be linked to the UI data.
I think there's also, I'm not an expert on this, but I think at the sub-associate's degree level, some of those certificates, there's not a common coding process for that. It's very, very messy to really try and figure out. And if you might have an institution that has its own sort of named and designed certificate that, it would be different at another institution. So I think actually being able to drill down on that is still a challenge, right?
Definitely. Yeah. You can see something. For example, in the Ohio data, I can observe that somebody earned a certificate. I can observe what kind of certificate they earned, and I can observe what they declared as their major.
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right. That's not all the detail that we would really want to evaluate these workforce certificate programs, but I get partway there.
So, I guess I'm not sure I've seen the effect of the K-20 state longitudinal data systems. We have worked in 5 or 6 or 7 states to try to take K-12 community college, 4-year college, and link that to UI data. It's extremely difficult. We have kind of an infrastructure to do it, and it's still very difficult to do that. State policies, the interpretations of FERPA change, so we may have a relationship with one state now, and that in next year that we won't have access to those data. So I think that it's a very difficult process, and certainly if we want to be able to easily and have a much broader, Adele's working with the professor, Bridget Terry-Long, who worked with those Ohio's data for 10 years. So that's the kind of relationship that you need to have to get access to those data. If you as a researcher go into some state capital, it's going to be years before you get a nice data set that you can work with. So I think that's as far as really being able to understand what that is. We do have the National Clearinghouse data, which is which allows us to track individual students among, throughout the whole education system. It doesn't have a lot of detail in it, but
Doesn't go back
nevertheless,
to K-12.
That's right. So, well, and starting to, but that's so we're in kind of a wild west of data, and I think there's some political currents that are actually making it more difficult for us to get those data now.
More questions?
Hi, I'm also someone with a second question. My question is about funding and accreditation for a lot of these manufacturing training programs that are at the community colleges. They are oftentimes non-credit bearing, or if they are, they're moving up towards an AAS degree, which doesn't transfer easily to a four-year degree. The funding side, if the programs are non-accredited, then you can't access federal financial aid or Pell Grants for these. So can you talk about maybe how the Higher Education Act, which is coming up, could affect this, or just policies that you've seen that can help ease this burden?
I also want to build on that question because I've been sort of interested in what changes about the programs depending on who's paying for it. If it's a student fund, is a student paying out of their pocket? Is it coming out of a federal grant if it's accredited? If the employer pays for it, if we saw some stuff in the Washington Post recently about the roles of unions in doing this kind of training when unions are paying for it.
Yep.
I mean, can we talk? So can we answer her question, but also sort of extend that a little bit and talk a little bit about the nature of how these programs might change depending on who's financing them?
I guess it's difficult to answer that question because in many cases it depends on the state. All the states are different with respect to how they regulate or certify, different programs. I mean, you'll have, some states fund non-credit, for example, and other states don't. So you'll find that in the states that fund non-credit, there's a lot more non-credit. And in the states that don't, lots of that non-credit is now incorporated into a degree program because you can have access to financial aid. I do think that that there's a trend towards trying to be more concrete about the requirement that students be in programs for them to be able to access financial aid. I think that's a good thing. We can make a program. I mean, you can be in a program which is not very well organized, called general studies, and that's, yes, you're in a program, but that doesn't really lead anywhere, isn't well organized, and doesn't, is not very effective. So I think that's one area. I mean, employers or colleges will do non-credit programs because they're easy to mount. They can do those quickly. They don't have to go to the state capitol to get them accredited or anything. An employer comes in and says, they want some training, or else there's layoffs and there's trainings. Those are the kind, the colleges can do those quickly, and in many cases they do those very effectively. And if they're going to go through a process that will make them part of a program, then those students will be eligible for financial aid. Then that slows that down. So
I would just say two things on this. One is a sort of broad comment, which is, if you just look at federal resources and how they're allocated around adult education and training, our Higher Education Act is our de facto workforce development program. We have the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity funding, but if you look at the amounts of money relative to the Title IV higher education, it's minuscule, small amounts of money. And so I think you're asking exactly the right question, which is, given that is in fact the case, we may not acknowledge it, but it is in fact the case, then how do you open that up, or how do you make sure that it's able to get to that objective? The second thing I would say is that I think there are been baby steps taken to try and put a little bit more flexibility in terms of how Pell and other Higher Education Act resources can be accessed. So ability to benefit, some of the waiver authority that around program length that individual institutions have. I think there are things that start to open that up, and I think doing that carefully and considered with good research is a good move for this next iteration of the Higher Education Act.
Well, and then there was just this announcement last week that the department is going to have a discussion about opening up Title IV to more non-traditional providers, and that was always put in the context of like coding academies and all this groovy stuff out of Silicon Valley. But I wonder whether it could also be some of these other kinds of training programs that are a little bit more manufacturing based, or that those people weren't, I don't know that those people are invited to the meeting yet, but.
Well, and then there's the discussion of certifications or competency-based education-based types of certifications, which and whether those will be accredited and to what extent students can access those financial aid when they're enrolled in those programs. So that's a huge issue of that. There's a lot of discussion about that. I think we have a long way to go before that all gets sorted out. But I think those are, I assume that as we discuss the reauthorization, that those types of things will be extensively discussed.
I think there's more questions out there, but can one of you hit on my union question at least a little bit?
Oh.
I mean, we've talked a lot about employer training,
Yep.
employer college training.
Yep.
I mean, is there a renewed role for union and college training programs?
I mean, certainly, I think there's huge promise there, particularly as you
Even
get...
with shrinking unions?
Even among shrinking unions. One thing that unions do that an individual employer doesn't is they tend to work across firms. And so you end up with consortia, which I think gives programs of study much more impact and meaning because they're working across multiple firms. Given with the limitations of where unions are these days, I think there are some definite possibilities there. And I know, particularly in healthcare, there's quite a bit of work, really innovative work going on. In fact, I think today there's a meeting just across one of the rivers in town here around how to design apprenticeship and other kinds of incumbent worker training in healthcare.
Back there, thank you.
Hi, I'm Gretchen Peacock from Lockheed Martin, and there was a lot of discussion in the last panel about publicly held versus privately held companies and their flexibility in short-term versus long-term decision-making and what their goals are. And there's been a lot of discussion in this panel about the onus being on employers to take the lead in a lot of these activities. And so I was wondering if you had either any suggestions, recommendations, or success stories in publicly held companies working with community colleges and how that's played out.
So I mean, we certainly have plenty of examples of publicly held companies that are publicly traded companies that are doing great partnership work with community colleges.
Is there something that the community colleges side can do to make that work better?
Well,
maybe?
so I think number one is to be able to tell a story about outcomes and results. Though, I think from the privately held companies, you don't hear a lot of talk about return on investment. My sense is that being able to have that backing in larger companies where you have to go to the CFO's office and say why this is an important investment of company resources. So I think it behooves us to have a little bit more. And who's from the Manufacturing Institute? That's the ROI calculator. So that's a great development. That's really good. And we should have more of that, I think, in order to get the publicly traded companies.
I think maybe you're from Michigan, so you might know more about this. I mean, historically, the community colleges have had a great relationship with the auto manufacturers. So now I think that is complicated a little bit now because I know in many of the programs that they had before, which were associate degree programs, are now bachelor's degree programs. So that some of the relationships that the colleges have had have either revolved or have gone away. So I'm not sure what. If Chrysler has some kind of training program at the community colleges, I'm not sure how they're calculating that ROI, but they're certainly extensive. So I guess I would say that I mean, there's certainly many examples, as John said, of cases where colleges have worked together.
If I can say one other thing, which is I think there is increasing conversation about treating talent pipelines more like supply chains. And that's a conversation the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has been leading, but I've been hearing it independently from company recruiters and talent specialists, which means that they tend to be concentrating on institutions that seem to be able to deliver folks with the right skills and the right quantities. That they are really trying to set expectations, do better expectation setting through their so-called supply chain with educators. And I think all that then speaks to this need to be very focused on outcomes and being able to sort of deliver to specification, if you will.
And if the colleges can get themselves past gagging on that phrase, supply chain, and not thinking about their students.
Yeah, right.
Fair enough.
That can see a cultural problem, actually.
Yeah. I thought it was great that in the previous panel about talking about the role of employers in providing training, because I think that we've gotten to the point where there's less employer training. I think historically we've seen that employer training is, there's a direct relationship between the amount of education that the person has and the amount of employer training that they get. So if you have a master's degree, you'll get tons of employer training, but if you have an associate degree, you get much less. So I do think it's I was reading something in The Guardian the other day, and they said, there's a skills gap and employers couldn't find anyone. So they did something unusual. They got somebody from McDonald's and they trained them, and that person now is doing a great job. And I said, well, so we've gotten to the point where it's an unusual strategy that employers are going to provide training to workers. So I do think I think we need to think about that when we hear about the skills gap stuff. And so I really applaud the previous panel for emphasizing the importance of that, because I think that's something we've lacked here, or we haven't put enough emphasis on that. And another reason why I think it's difficult to really get to broad apprenticeship program.
Okay, well.
And I'd like to applaud.
Well, yeah, with that, what's old is new again, and we'll have to wrap it.
I'd like to applaud this panel for the sharp debate.